Okay, so I guess one thing that literature professors do in the 21st century is that, like, in part, they use Macs, right? And so this is like a sort of requisite look. The thick glasses and the Mac, right, is like, I just need to be at a coffee shop, I think. But the question that I'm asking today, and I'll do so, this presentation is really less about me and my colleagues than it is about the university as an institution. And I don't mean IPFW, I just mean, like, you know, the generic, the idea of the university. And I've been interested in some of these issues for a long time, and I want to talk about two things that ideally will help you sort of make sense of your experience as college students in the 21st century. So I think that's sort of a broad goal I have today, is for you to think about your experience as a consequence of processes that date back, in my argument, to the 19th century with the birth of the modern research university. And those two things I'm interested in are, one, what I'm going to call sort of the liberalization or the opening up of the college curriculum. And I don't mean politically liberal, I mean freedom of choice is what I mean. And then I'm going to talk briefly about this idea of the professionalization of the faculty, the notion that it became sort of inevitable or necessary that your faculty members were trained to have PhDs, to contribute research to fields and publish that research in venues like the research journal, okay? And then I'm going to sort of lastly talk about the evolution of literary studies. I'm going to try to kind of lay that on top of the story I'm telling about the opening up of the curriculum and the professionalization of your humble professors. So this is coming from, I kind of have two research interests. One of which is I'm trained in the field of American studies, American literary studies, and I write articles, and I'm working on a book about early American literature and its relationship to economic history. So that's sort of like that's coming out of my training as a PhD student. The second thing that I'm interested, however, is this idea of the history of the field of literary studies, and that's kind of what I'm sharing with you today. In my approach to this topic of the history of literary studies, or what we working in this field call the history of the profession, is my approach is what I would call cultural materialist. And what I mean by that is my assumption is that there are material processes and institutions that shape this thing that we call literary studies, okay? And the same is true for any field of study on this campus. There's a history to these fields. And the assumption is things like curriculum, things like syllabi, things like your professor's articles, that those have changed in response to the culture and to history and the times. That these aren't static documents, but have evolved throughout time, okay? And so the kind of big question that I'm sort of interested in is, you know, how has literary studies evolved, right, as the university has changed? But to answer my own question, I'll begin with your answers on this, because I have some ideas where this might go, and I have some sort of, I would call absurd and inappropriate means of what literature professors do. But I'll be curious to hear from you early in the talk. Like, what do you guys think of, what do you think literature professors do? And I should tell you that I chose not to say English professors so as not to offend my colleagues in writing, creative writing, the study of writing, and linguists, right? So maybe English professor as a cultural sort of phenomenon might work here as well. But what do you guys think literature professors do? And you will not offend me in your answer. Yes, in the back, yeah.
Challenge people to think.
I'm certainly not offended by that. Very nice. Yeah, we challenge people to think. Would you say that all professors do that, or is that peculiar to?
High schools, teachers don't tend to do that. I know professors, a lot of them try to make people think outside the box, because we've been taught through high school just to respond to questions. And I feel like our job in a liberal institution is to get people to think.
Okay, so professors get people to think critically, and that seems to be sort of in keeping with the idea of the institution as this liberal, open, critical place. Okay. Other thoughts? Marty, yes.
What I've experienced in a lot of my literature classes is that my professors tend to be, I don't have a good word for this, but they kind of are like ringmasters of discussion.
Masters of discussion. I'm not offended by that either. Very nice. Yeah. Okay.
Like, you kind of bring in these new ideas that we might not have thought of, even if we've read the book 1,000 times. And while the students are discussing among themselves, you kind of rein us in so we don't spend the whole time talking about, like, leaves or something. I don't know.
When it's not appropriate, perhaps, because leaves are often like the leaves of grass, right? There's entire books about leaves. Okay, so Marty, I think to make sense of your answer, we can think about the idea of the teacher-scholar as a professional who knows the bounds of the field, right? So leaves are not appropriate at this time because the text doesn't require that, bringing us back to our object of study, which is the text. I should say that when I ask what do literature professors do, I'm interested in how do we relate to our field of study, which is the literary object, okay? And I'll talk about how that's changed. But right, I think that's the notion of expertise, which became very important in the 19th century, that the professor in any field can sort of bring the conversation back to, can make connections to the area of expertise and beyond. Okay, no one wants to like tell me like these stereotypes of movies, what the literature professor does? Drinks too much, womanizes, right? Like every movie that has a literature professor. That's a good point. It's a very common stereotype, alas. But here we go. So this is from Facebook. My colleague, Dr. Fleming, he's very collegial and is always advertising events that we do in our department. So he posts something to Facebook. These are my two children, and says, Dr. Kopec giving a talk on blah blah blah. And so because I knew that people would perhaps answer the question in ironic ways, I tried to preempt that by saying, just so we know, okay, the answer is not nothing, right? It's a silly title, but here's what I'm really interested in. And then nevertheless, one of my distinguished colleagues and another person that I don't know had to sort of chime in and say, what does my distinguished colleague say? Wear tweed jackets with elbow patches and smoke pipes. And then this other guy says, drink only the finest sherry while adding some more koi to the piano-shaped pond. Okay, so like, sport coats, yeah, there are a lot of sport coats. Okay, so like what, these two sort of jokey responses are speaking to what kind of assumptions or what kind of like cultural sort of stereotype about the literature professor? Pretentious. Perhaps, yeah, pretentious. Yes, so that is right, I think, but this is an esoteric sort of antiquarian hobbyist interest, okay? That cannot easily be folded into our utilitarian concepts of what a higher education should do or what it might do. Okay. So then I just started Googling. I had no idea. It's some odd phrase I didn't necessarily like. I started Googling memes, and so what my friends think I do, this sort of like kumbaya moment, right? I guess like an excessive authoritarian. What society thinks I do, right? Because of the sort of lack of like the 9-to-5 schedule, perhaps. What my students think I do, which is like respond to emails instantly, grade papers the second they're turned in, right? What I think I do, Dead Poet Society, right? Inspiring young people. And then what I really do, which is just, hang my head in shame and guilt and anxiety. Yeah, okay. I'm surprised that no one, maybe you're all just being too polite. I'm surprised that no one said that the professor corrects grammar. Okay, because that, what's that?
A Nazi, a grammar Nazi?
Yeah, okay. So this notion of the English professor spends, her time thinking about how other people misspeak, right? And so often I'll tell someone that, what do you do? Oh, I'm an English professor. They will like almost immediately stop talking, right, for fear of judgment, right? And so I think that's a common assumption too, which is this notion of protecting grammar. And I'm going to suggest that that's, of course, not reality today. Okay, so I mentioned I want to do two things today. One, I want to talk about this opening up of the college curriculum. Two, I want to talk about the professionalization of the faculty, and then to talk about how literary studies has evolved. And again, just to be clear, when I say the liberalization, what I mean is freedom of choice or opening up, right? And this is a response to, this is a product of the 19th century, and it's most associated with, I'm trying to remember my order of my slides here. It's most associated with a longtime president of Harvard in the middle of the 19th century, Charles Eliot. He did not invent the elective system, but he was the foremost advocate of the elective system after the Civil War in the United States. So we're talking about in the 1860s throughout the end of the 19th century. So you might kind of wonder, well, like why did the curriculum need to be liberalized? Why did it need to be opened up, right? And so prior to this moment in the 19th century, to pursue a course of college study was in fact quite determined. There was no choice involved in the United States, okay? And that was known today as the classical curriculum. I'm going to make some jokes at my colleague, Dr. Fleming's expense. Dr. Fleming teaches Latin here at campus, and the classical curriculum was grounded in rhetoric, logic, these sort of 7 liberal arts coming from the medieval academy, but also in the classical languages that, of course, were not spoken, Latin and Greek. And the premise here was that this is mental training for the professions, for law, for medicine, for business, but also we were training clergymen who would need knowledge of biblical languages, okay? And so the grounding here was sort of practical. We need people to study biblical text in their original languages, but it was also viewed as a mental discipline, okay? And this is where we get the notion of the idea of recitation, which I'm sure many of you who went to large state universities for your PhD or research universities will recognize that term. But the idea was that you would not contribute to class, to knowledge in the class. Rather, you would regurgitate what the professor said. And there's all kinds of funny student diaries or student sort of articles written from the perspective of being a student of the classical curriculum. And they'll talk about, falling asleep, right, as the professor was kind of droning on about the Latin declensions or what have you, okay? Yeah, exactly. Dr. Fleming, by the way, is involved in this movement sweeping the United States called Living Latin, right? So he's about enlivening this so-called dead language. But the key here is that to go to college in, say, 1830s, and there's this famous report in 1828 called the Yale Report, which doubled down on this idea of no choice, but that meant to have no choice whatsoever in your curriculum, okay? And so obviously think about where you are today as students who are perhaps in the midst of scheduling. Okay, so I have some quotes that one didn't transfer very well from the Apple program. But this prominent Philadelphia physician from the early American period, he was a signer of the Declaration, he was an educational theorist, lots of interesting ideas. He was a opponent of the classical curriculum, and he thought it was overly conservative, okay? And he says the following, I was thinking of you, Fleming. To spend 4 or 5 years in learning 2 dead languages, he says, Rush says, Latin and Greek, is to turn our backs on a gold mine in order to amuse ourselves catching butterflies, right? So to go back to the gentleman who said literature professors perhaps are not useful, right? Like this is what Rush is kind of saying, right? It's not useful. We turn our back on the sort of opening up of science, for example, and teaching these dead languages. And so the gold mine that he has in mind, again, he was a doctor, a physician, is the sort of expansion of scientific knowledge in the 19th century. So there are some very important fields that are emerging, things that I only know very little about, but like for instance, the field of geology in the middle of the 1830s was making all kinds of interesting findings about the study of the age of the earth, okay? Now, why might that be problematic for a conservative curriculum?
If you're churning out clergymen, and
Right.
somebody tells you that your thought of how the earth was made is different than it should be.
Okay, so these are scary findings, right? These challenge tradition, okay? And so we have here on the one hand this sort of desire to maintain control over the curriculum, and on the other hand this argument that, look, we're having new knowledge that's being discovered, right, through the scientific method. This needs to sort of find its way into the curriculum, okay? So let's see, this led to this was one sort of force that led to this opening up of the curriculum. I mentioned Charles Eliot as the president of Harvard, and I just took a screenshot of some offerings that the English department has for the fall. So this is sort of like an advertisement slash has an actual purpose. But this notion of beginning from Old English down to 20th century poetry, right? That's where we are today, right? To think about someone who's saying, like the fact that we would need an argument against this conservative thing to hear is pretty remarkable, I think, right? That this is a good example of this sort opening up. So I tried to kind of cherry pick some quotes from Eliot that I think might be amusing or interesting. But at the beginning of this essay that Eliot writes, and he was prolific with the lectures and the writing, he wrote this essay called Liberty in Education. And what he means is this choice, this freedom of choice for students to choose their curriculum, okay? And he's pretty savvy rhetorically. He says, look, I understand that there are a number of reasons why people might be opposed to opening up the curriculum, okay? And he says the following. He's like, one of the major arguments against opening up the curriculum that he's imagining is this idea that young people are just too immature to choose. It's too important of a choice, okay, to make this decision. So I know I'm here at the Anthropology Club, and by the way, I meant to thank Kelsey for inviting me. I meant to thank Autumn for making this happen. Thank you so much. Anthropology students, it's anthropology like my own discipline, right? It's often on these lists of like useless degrees or something like this, right? And I'm sure you have inevitably been asked the question, am I right about this? What are you going to do with the anthropology class? So rather than congratulating Kelsey on graduating in spring, someone probably immediately says, what are you going to do with that, right? Okay. So that question would not be imaginable in the classical curriculum, right? Because there was no choice to make. There was no need to justify the choice, right? So there would be no anxiety about what my child might choose wrong, right? That's a modern phenomenon. The privilege to answer that question, right, is a modern phenomenon. But here is the president of Harvard in the late 19th century. And I hope this takes me to where I want it to take me. Okay. So this long quote here, again, Eliot is sort of talking about this argument that young people are too immature to choose. This is why we need to choose for them, okay? And so he says, the pretended parental or sham monastic regime of the common American college seems to me to bring out the childishness rather than the manliness. And he's talking about men only, manliness of the average student. So what he's saying here is that this sham paternalism that we have to choose for the student, that actually forces students to live down to that expectation that we have, that they're going to be immature, okay? Then he goes on to say, this is evidenced by the pranks he plays, the secret societies in which he rejoices, and the barbarous or silly customs which he accepts and transmits. The conservative argument is a college must deal with the student as he is, immature and so on. He will be what he has been, namely a thoughtless, aimless, lazy, and possibly vicious boy. Therefore, a policy which gives him liberty, this argument that he's parroting says, is impracticable. The progressive argument, on the other hand, in which he advocates, is this: adapt college policy to the best students and not to the worst. Improve the policy, and in time, the evil fruits of a mistaken policy will disappear. I would only urge that at this point, this far-seeing educational policy would take shape, take root in the United States. Okay, so it's this interesting kind of argument about human nature, right? That if we're going to sort of expect the worst of our young people, then we'll continue to sort of put them in this position of having no choice. If we're going to expect the best of them, we'll do the opposite. Okay, and I think that seems, to my ear, that seems like a fairly modern debate about this anxiety over choice and this kind of thing. So I'd be happy to talk about that in Q&A. All right, so if the curriculum was not inevitably open to you as students, okay, if it was not inevitable that you would be able to choose 20 English classes, right, or any number of classes that are offered on this campus. And by the way, Eliot has, I was thinking of our own campus, he has this interesting line in that essay, Liberty in Education. He says, what could stop the course offerings on a campus? We have all this new exciting knowledge, right? And he says there's one limit to the growth of the campus, and he uses the word poverty, right? So he's talking about like university budgets, right? Only university budgets, he imagines, could stop this check. Okay, in my mind and in my argument today, the liberalization, the opening up of the curriculum goes hand in hand with the professionalization of the faculty, with the idea that faculty are first and foremost at the university to investigate, a very important term in the history of the modern university, or to do research that will then find its way into the curriculum, okay? So another of my esteemed colleagues in English, Dr. Bischoff, I'm sure many of you know him, often will make this argument that teaching and research are inseparable. This is there's a history to that argument, okay? So the modern research university puts at its foundation the notion that university or faculty research will feed into this expansive curriculum that's predicated on choice, okay? So the origins, and again, I'm interested in the United States. There's a long European history. There's a long history to the modern university in the Arab world as well. But there's the origins of the modern research university in the United States among scholars has one very specific beginning point, and that's in 1876 with the creation of the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And that, like the University of Chicago, which is another private research university, was the sort of child of an endowment by an industrialist, okay? And the first president of Johns Hopkins was a guy named Daniel Coit Gilman, and he had this pretty radical idea. So whereas Eliot had the radical idea to open up the curriculum, Gilman's radical idea was to basically let faculty do whatever they want in terms of research, okay? And he gives us this sort of interesting line, and this, by the way, I just sort of like cherry-picked this quote from his inaugural address when Johns Hopkins was founded from the website, the current website for Johns Hopkins. So if you go to Johns Hopkins and you click About Us, it gives you this history. And this is what Gilman says: the goal of Johns Hopkins as an institution is the encouragement of research and the advancement of individual scholars who, by their excellence, will advance the sciences they pursue and the society where they dwell. I think that last line is pretty interesting, given the sort of regional emphasis on IPFW's campus as a metropolitan university. The assumption is that autonomous faculty research will, 1, improve the curriculum, that's Eliot, 2, will improve the institution, the field, 3, will improve the community, okay? So again, these debates that you might hear about sort of utility or not utility, they have this long history that I'm trying to bring to you today. I had a point that I wanted to make that's escaped me, but now I'll have to come back to it. Okay. All right, so what does this all have to do with literary studies? And by the way, I'm planning on us having enough time to possibly turn to a poem to kind of put into practice some of these things that I'm going to talk about here in a second. But so on the one hand, opening up with the curriculum, the second hand, the professionalization of the faculty, that's what I was thinking of. Johns Hopkins in 1876. What's interesting about that, and it's a successful model, okay? So institutions, are we familiar with this idea of convergence, where institutions tend to converge on similar practices, right? So Hopkins becomes a model that state universities that are founded after the Morrill Act, okay, tend to follow, okay? And so lots of universities start churning out PhDs. Lots of universities start establishing journals. This research ethos kind of takes root at the university, okay? And it displaces these older ideas of the classical curriculum. It displaces these older ideas about the non-specialist appreciator of something like literature. Okay, so we're going to now talk about the evolution of literary studies. And again, to get back to my question, what do literature professors do? I'm interested in asking that by telling you about how the professor relates to her object of study, which is, in this case, is the literary text. Okay, so I have like 4 or 5 different moments that I kind of, this is a long history. I'm obviously going to be simplifying for the sake of this presentation. But this is from the late 1800s, and this is a Cornell English professor. And what's interesting about Cornell is it's the one Ivy that has a land grant route, right? So in some ways it's more like where I did my degree, Ohio State, than it is like, say, Harvard, okay? But we have this professor of English at Cornell, this guy named Corson, and he writes in this book, The Aims of Literary Study. Those kinds of documents are interesting for my cultural materialist project to get a sense of how the field has evolved, right? What were people thinking the field was at this time and place? And so what I think is interesting here is the assumption that Corson's making about that he's assuming that we don't need interpretation. Okay, and that's sort of a bad assumption if you're trying to professionalize the field, I think. So how is the best response to the essential life of a poem to be secured by the student, by the teacher from the student, Corson asks? I answer, by the fullest interpretive vocal rendering of it. And what he means is like the best performance of it in speech, okay? And by fullest, I mean that the vocal rendering must exhibit not only the definite intellectual articulation or framework of a poem, through emphasis, grouping, etc., but must, through intonation, varied quality of voice, and other means, exhibit that which is indefinite to the intellect. The latter is the main object of vocal rendering. And so what's interesting here is that the assumption is that the poem itself doesn't need an elaborate methodology to uncover its meaning. Okay, we don't need a trained methodology to write an article about the meaning of this poem. Instead, we need someone to be basically like an actor. Okay, it's like, you know, the best class to take to do this would be acting rather than, say, something like in literary studies, right? And that's this model is going to sort of be completely out of fashion here, and it's not going to take that long for this field called philology to take root in literary studies. Okay, so I mentioned 1876. Hopkins initiates this research ethos. Okay, now it's much easier if you're a scientist to map your career, your work onto a research imperative, right? You do experiments, you have a lab, and so on, right? Humanistic disciplines like literary studies struggle to kind of find their footing in this culture, okay? So one hypothesis is that thus we get literature professors as quote unquote philologists, which is a word that can translate to the love of words. But it proceeded, it imagined itself, philology did, as a science, as an empirical science, okay? And just to give you a sense of the sort of claims of the philologist, I have this quote from the Publications of the Modern Language Association, or PMLA, which was founded in the late 1800s. And a former president of the MLA, Albert S. Cook, writes, he was speaking to the convention, the MLA convention, and he defines philology in the following way. He says that the philologist seeks to, quote, relive the life of the past, to enter by the imagination into the spiritual existences of all the historic protagonists of civilization in a given period and area of culture, to think the thoughts, to feel the emotions, to partake the aspirations recorded in literature, to become one with humanity, and then to judge rightly these various disclosures of the human spirit, and to reveal to the world their true significance and relative importance. I mean, this is quite lofty, right? Like, I'm going to use the literary text to explain the history of human society, okay? What's interesting to me about this is that this is kind of driven by this empiricism, that we can uncover some historical facts, okay? But what's also interesting about this is the role that literature plays here for the philologist. And the literary text here is quite passive, right? It's something that just sort of holds a mirror up to history. It tells us what people thought. This is what it meant to be French in 1066 or something like this, right? Like, this is what conjunctions in the medieval poem Beowulf mean, like this kind of, like, medievalists were at the forefront of this, at this field. But, you know, like, a familiarity with multiple languages, tracing the roots of words, these kinds of things, right? But the literary text was a passive, inert object that one could sort of grab the reality of history out of, okay? This philology is quite influential for let's say, a generation, okay, 20 or 30 years. And then it propagated itself as fields do in the modern research university, in primary organs, primary journals with titles that these are still in print today, titles like PMLA, titles like Modern Philology, Philological Quarterly, English Literary History, you know, these sorts of journals that are venues for the new investigators, the new research professors to share their research, to establish a field, okay? So this kind of work here, this is not the work of the amateur appreciator, or someone who just sort of appreciates literature. This is the work of a scientific investigator. Okay. All right. I'll get going here. What's interesting, I don't need to read this whole thing. What's interesting is that was 1898. The thing about philology is so great, we can understand the past from the text. 1925, a prominent philologist at Yale all of a sudden is like, man, we've gone too far, he says. Like, I'm sick of all these essays that have become rote. I'm sick of all this sort of, these essays that do the same thing. And every sort of moment I'm going to share with you today in the history of literary studies, there's always going to be an essay like this. There's always going to be an essay that says, as soon as the essay started, I knew how it would end. Okay? This sense of internal exhaustion is, I don't think it's peculiar to literary studies, or maybe it is, I don't know, but this kind of self-critical assessment of the field. And so by 1925, this guy Fourier is like saying, we've gone too far as philologists. We need to get back to appreciating literature. Okay? And it turns out that there would be an entire movement that would try to, on the one hand, appreciate literature, to judge it, and on the other hand, maintain some kind of scientific purity in approaching the literary text. Okay? And if I know some of you are from my L202 class or have had a literary interpretation class, but the method of close reading has become the sort of foundational skill for the literature professor. Okay? Identifying meaning through a close analysis of what the new critics called the text itself. Okay? And the assumption, and this is kind of a fancy phrase, but the assumption that the new critics made in the middle of the 20th century was that we could read a poem and we could write an article about its meaning and publish it in journals solely by viewing it as a self-contained object. Okay? The only evidence that we need, and this is the language they use, evidence, the only evidence we need as the research investigator is the poem itself. Okay, we don't need to know anything about the author's life. We don't need to know anything about the author's culture. In fact, that would be to our detriment to get hung up on what so-and-so thought as he or she was writing the poem. Okay? So if you've ever written a literary analysis paper, how many of you have done that before? Been assigned literary analysis, right? You're more or less doing this, right? You're looking at the text itself, you're figuring out relationships, patterns among the words, you're looking at oppositions, you're trying to find paradoxes, and you're doing what the new critics thought of as close reading. This is not on the slide, but one plausible theory about how this took root, the new criticism, was after the Second World War, thanks to the GI Bill, you have the expansion of the university, right? This is a true golden age. You have investment in the sciences, you have investment in research, and you have a ton of students, okay? And close reading became a method that could easily be taught and replicated, right? You don't need to know everything about the human past to go back to the philologist, okay? You can kind of teach this method that can be reproduced. All right, in class, when I'm trying to get students to do close reading, inevitably, students want to ask questions about the author's life and times, okay? So in 1946, these Yale professors, Wimsatt and Beardsley, wrote this essay called The Intentional Fallacy, right? And this essay has at its core this attempt to turn literary study into a science, okay? So they say that it's too impressionistic, it's too difficult to pin down to reconstruct an author's thought process. Okay, that's not actually objective, they say. We're looking for an objective criticism in the essay. And it's not objective to think about subjectivity, is what they're saying. Okay? So what they do is they assume that poetry is the special kind of thing that's different from any other kind of language. Okay? They're very eager to maintain this point, that poetry is a special use of language that is different than, say, science, or different than, say, communicative discourse. Okay? And in order to sort of establish this premise, in order to sort of propagate it, they developed this method of close reading, which is very strictly anti the author's intention. Okay? So they're talking about a very difficult poem in the essay, T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the poem, but it's this modernist poem that's really interesting about this character's consciousness. Okay? And he sort of confronts these existential dilemma. He can't make choices. So he's like, should I eat a peach, right? Like it's a crippling answer to him that he asks himself. And they're talking about this poem, Wimsatt and Beardsley are, and they say that we can only stick with the language that we have. Intrinsic evidence, internal evidence. There's no reason to look outside the poem because it's the self-contained, self-referential object. And they end here by saying, let's imagine that in response to clarify this kind of critical debate, T.S. Eliot all of a sudden comes to our classroom and says, you know what, actually this is what I meant when I wrote The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. according to the new critics, the text itself, okay, they said that would be irrelevant for generating scholarly arguments about the meaning of J. Alfred Prufrock. Why? Because we have the poem that we have the text itself, okay? And then they say this thing, they conclude their essay by saying the following. Our point is that such an answer to such an inquiry would have nothing to do with the poem. It wouldn't matter what he said, T.S. Eliot, okay? Prufrock, it would not be a critical inquiry. It would not be research. It would not be an investigation. Critical inquiries, unlike bets, are not settled in this way. Critical inquiries are not settled by consulting the oracle, they say, and the oracle being T.S. Eliot, of course, okay? So the idea here is that some conversation that you have with an author, that's not going to replace, that's not going to displace scholarly methodology, which is close reading and the various assumptions that it makes, okay? People have been unsatisfied. Students are often unsatisfied with this. Well, he says this, right? According to the new critics. That's a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. All right, so how am I doing? This is gonna have to be quick. Okay. Philologists, all about history. Human history, right? New critics, self-contained poetry. Let's take the poem and let's remove it from its historical context, okay? In the 1980s, we swing back to history and literary studies. And we get this thing called the New Historicism. And the New Historicism at its core assumes that there is a reciprocal relationship between literature and history. So rather than grabbing objective history out of the passive text, as the philologists did, the New Historicists assumed that literature actually helps actively build social reality, okay? So what we confront as reality is in part maintained by things like poems. It's pretty interesting. It gives a lot of power to poems, I think, right? And there's a book written by two chief figures in New Historicism, Stephen Greenblatt, very prominent Shakespeare scholar, and Catherine Gallagher, a very prominent 18th century scholar. And they argue that rather than assuming that the text is self-referential, they liken it to the Holy Communion. They say rather than making it this sacrament, okay, that we can't ask questions about, we would prefer to seek instead, through our research, this idea of the creative powers that are outside the text, that shape the text, and that are both inside the text, responding back to to history, okay? So rather than just focusing on the internal evidence, they look outward to culture and history, okay? And so the assumption here is that it's not enough to kind of stick with the internal evidence. The internal evidence raises problems, raises themes, raises questions that we can only answer by going outside, okay? And there's kind of this like radical politics that they have behind their argument. They argue that the new criticism actually maintained hierarchies, that it put on a pedestal certain art objects over other art objects. And they think that in turning culture as a whole into a text, that destabilizes those hierarchies. So if you read essays in the New Historicism, what counts as evidence is, of course, something like a poem, but you'll also see advertisements. You also see films, right? You also see stuff from popular media, popular culture, okay? All right, so I think what I'll do here is I want to sort of end by thinking about what's next, right, in literary studies. And we had a conversation yesterday on campus about the possibilities for this new thing called the digital humanities on this campus. But if the new critics were interested in this thing called close reading, where you isolate the poem and you look at it apart from culture, okay? The digital humanities, as the name might suggest, uses the powers of computing, okay? Uses the powers of data visualization and information analysis, and it looks at literature from a distance. Their main rhetoric is that of distance, okay? So distant reading is getting very far away from the individual text, and what happens is that the individual novels that have generated so many insights from literature professors, like say in my own field, Moby Dick, right, or a Jane Austen novel, that instead becomes one data point on a curve, right? So it's about sort of getting a picture of literary history using computers, but from a distance. And I have some examples of this. So an early book in data visualization of literary history is by a scholar named Franco Moretti, an Italian scholar who's a professor at Stanford. He is the founder of the literary lab at Stanford. So that name's telling you something, right? To get us back to philology perhaps. And what Moretti does here is this says figure 9, British novelistic genres 1740 to 1900. And this is broken down by genre. I know it's not a very good picture. But instead of isolating those sort of exceptional canonical titles, right, they just kind of become one point on this little graph. Okay? Other examples of this, scholar at Notre Dame, Matt Wilkins. And what he suggests is that what he does is he takes all these novels written in the United States from 1851. He gets them into a readable form for doing text or corpora analysis. Okay, and he runs these novels through a machine, right, through an algorithm. And what he's looking for is he's looking for references to places in the novel. Okay, and the hypothesis that he's working with is that 1851, this is a moment of great nationalism in the United States. I wonder if our novels are sort of American-focused, American-based, right? And his research, as we might imagine, is quite surprising. We have all kinds of references in these novels from 1851 to Europe, say. We have even references to far-flung places in Asia and Africa and South America, right? So in using this data visualization and running, say, 100 novels through an algorithm and then plotting those findings on a map, visualizing the data, he's able to kind of challenge this idea that the American novel was, in fact, very American, right? That the American novel might be more sort of transnational, might be more international in its spirit, okay? I'd be curious to know if this seems interesting to us or if we're skeptical about this or what, but digital humanities using computers to visualize the data turns perhaps the literary text into a data point, right? That seems a far cry from the new critic saying, this is the Holy Communion, right? This poem here. Okay, I'll wrap this up here by sharing some digital humanities work on this very campus, okay? So Dr. Bassett, Dr. Fleming's my colleague in English, and Dr. Link's colleague as well in English. We have here at the circulating library, and circulating libraries were these kind of early library institutions that you could sort of pay membership to, and you could check books out. I'm glad Troy was not here to hear me say that, because that sounded too easy. But this is what Bassett has done. Okay. So he's got this database of Victorian fiction, Victorian era of literature, 1837 to early 1900s. And does anyone know like famous Victorian era authors? Like if you were to take a Victorian literature class, who's likely to be on your syllabus? This is how my classes go. I ask like Jeopardy-based questions. This is why the curriculum should not be open, maybe. Is this why? Yes, sir, yes.
Mark Twain?
Mark Twain's an American, but he's writing at the same time. Okay. So close. He might even be in the database, because his stuff was probably published in England. Since I'm an American literature professor, let's go with that, okay? Anyone else? Yeah.
Bram Stoker, maybe?
Sure.
I don't know.
Mark Twain, here we go. All right, so Bassett's got one Twain novel in here, The Gilded Age. Doyle. Okay, so quite a presence, right, in the Victorian literary field. And yet, now, thanks to the digital humanist, we have a data point on a list, okay? So what's interesting about this, if you want to get a sense of like Doyle's contribution to the field as a whole, right, this would be very important information for you, right? That he worked with these publishers, he published on these dates, this many titles. If you're a new critic who's interested in in close reading, putting the text right there, it's not going to be as helpful for you, right? Because you're not actually reading the artifact attending to its language. Okay, so Dr. Bassett has, I think, a very compelling idea that what we need for the future of literary studies is doing a little bit of both, a little bit of close, a little bit of distant reading. But this is just to give you some sense of what computers can do. My favorite example from my own field is this, which is that if you've taken classes with me before, you know whether or not it's necessarily relevant. One of my few talents as an American literature professor is to turn any comment a student makes into some insight about how Herman Melville's Moby Dick, right? Okay, and
It's like a superpower.
something like that, right? If we open this hyperlink, this is actually an Indiana University library initiative. There was a librarian in Southern California, Lyle Wright, who did all these interesting things with bibliography at the Huntington Library. And Indiana University has digitized this, but so there's 111 titles, right? 1851. All of a sudden, Moby Dick is just one of 111. Okay, so it seems there's all these implications for distant reading when you get the text itself out of your face. Okay, I guess with that I'll end our tour of the liberalization of the curriculum, professionalization of the faculty, and trying to map the evolution of literary studies onto that. Be happy to address questions or comments and the like. So thanks a lot for listening.
I have a small question. Sorry.
I want you to apologize.
Oh, you shoake your head. Anyway, so this distance literature thing.
Distance reading, right?
Distance reading. You're supposed to look at the trends of literature, as a whole, and
Well, that's one thing you can do.
yeah.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder because throughout most of my college experience, what you're doing when you look at a text is look at the kind of truth or human information that you can pull from it. So how would you do that with distance reading? Do you just pull oh yeah, everyone's interested in this one thing that they've written about 1,000 times?
Right.
Or do you pull more of the kind of market sort of, oh well, if you market to the sense of belonging that people seem to lack in their lives, then you can sell 1,000 books or something like that.
So is the digital humanist trying to find some secret of success? Is that what you mean in the literary marketplace? Okay.
It's a little too far away for me.
Oh, I see. You're not comfortable with the distance.
It's a really far distance.
Yeah. Okay. Marty, you are in the majority from the perspective of English or literary studies. Most of my colleagues in the professional literary studies are made nervous by distant reading. And to go back to the idea of the professionalization of the faculty, it's because at the core of the professional literary studies for the longest time has been the skill of close reading. We are trained first and foremost in close analysis of the literary text. Okay, that's one reason for people's discomfort. The other reason for people's discomfort is that digital humanists. There are some digital humanists who take as a rule that you are not a digital humanist unless you're writing computer code. Okay, and so many people who are trained in say English say, well, I don't have time to do that. I don't want to do that, right?
It just makes me wonder because you can read a graph really closely. I've taken communication with statistics, and it's important to know how to read graphs.
Yeah.
But what can you get out of it more than you would get out of looking closely at the context of a poem or something?
It's a great question.
That's my question.
The argument that digital humanists make is they say, look, Dr. Bassett just put his 14,000th title in his database, okay, of Victorian fiction. Most syllabi in Victorian literature across the United States probably deal with the same 5, 6, 7, 8 authors, right? The argument that digital humanists make is they say that's not a rational approach to the study of a field. It makes no sense to study exclusively Dickens, George Eliot, Doyle, when you have instead authors like Margaret Oliphant, who is the single most prolific author in Bassett's database. Probably no one's ever heard of her, right? So what distant reading gets us away from those kinds of biases, gets us away from those kinds of, perhaps they see themselves as sort of a freshening of perhaps stale conversations or something like that. Do we really need a 100th article on Herman Melville's Moby Dick or something like that? I say yes, but yeah, yes. Yes.
What's the origin of your cultural materialist approach? Is it from Marvin Harris, the anthropologist, who wrote the book Cultural Materialism, or is there some other?
Yeah, I don't know that book, but the origin is in fact a guy named Jeffrey Williams who's coined a phrase called critical university studies, and he's adopting this approach of cultural materialism. I will say in literary studies, when I say that phrase, what I have in mind is just a material approach to literature, that literature has a grounding in things like class conflict and things like gender conflict and conflicts in society. And the two big names that come to mind for literary studies at least are, in addition to Marx, would be Foucault, right? Michel Foucault, yeah. So I'd be curious to talk to you afterward, because I once heard a joke about a literary theorist that we take other disciplines sort of like bargain bin books, and then we make that into like a thing, right? So, anyway. Yes, sir, yeah.
2 questions.
Did you say 2 or 3?
2 questions.
Okay, I was going to say, I don't know about 3, but 2. Okay. Yeah.
I guess it's because they lead into each other, kind of.
Yep.
First off, the idea of distant reading, not concerning yourself with author retention, do you believe that only applies to certain pieces of literature, or do you believe that could work to all sorts of mediums?
Do I think that the intentional fallacy applies to things other than literature? Is that your question?
Essentially, like, is the idea of distant reading and not worrying about author intention, would that only apply to certain aspects of literature for the purposes of research, or do you think you could apply that to other mediums as well, like film,
Oh,
television?
yeah. That's right. Yeah, I do. I mean, I'd be talking out of my depth here. I know in film studies there's this sort of idea of really putting pressure on the auteur, the creative sort of consciousness. But in literary studies, putting intention to the side is the normative practice. Now, people are still interested in biography. I personally have written articles that uses biography as evidence, that kind of thing. But yes, the idea of the text itself, I think, applies to text-based disciplines like film, like Spanish literature, like what have you. If anyone was able to attend the lecture on campus last week, Dr. Steve Butz and I had a professor from Cornell, Dr. Bruno Bostiels. He was talking about a Mexican author, and his method was that despite this author's experience, these problems kind of emerge from the text, right? And then he kind of based the reading on that. So it's a very common assumption in literary studies. It's not the only way to do it, but it's the normative way to do it.
Okay, like I ask that just because as someone who does study film,
Yeah.
there's a great deal of my peers who have often called into question that the quality of something, and not just film, but other works of art, does have to do, at least in some part, with author intent, because there's a good deal about how something is constructed, and it's done for the purposes of illustrating a certain theme or
Sure.
meaning to it. And so taking away either author intent or maybe even the context of a period of time that it's set into affects its storytelling, what it has to say, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, I think what's interesting here is that this idea from the newest sources, this might be read as a kind of evasion of that very question, which is to say, rather than think about the individual consciousness, and what the new critics were doing more particularly was they were anti this idea of romanticism with a capital R, that the poem is just a fusion of the creative consciousness. Okay, because there's actually a way in which you can say that romantic form of poetry is anti-craft, leads us away from the sort of shape, right? Whereas the new critics are trying to say this is an artifact that was shaped, and we can judge it on its own terms, right? And then this is another turn of the screw with the new historicists. But that debate crops up in all of these debates, right? What's the consciousness behind the artifact, right? It's an interesting question. Yeah.
I just wanted to make an observation. So,
Yeah.
so what, like when you're talking about the close reading and the far reading and these different methods of, I mean, basically they're just research methods. So
Right.
it seems like just in any other science, I mean, depending on what question you're trying to answer, you would use a different method to investigate it.
Oh, that's a nice point.
So that's the purpose of this, is they're trying to establish a method to investigate certain questions.
Yes.
So I mean, for some questions, it would be more practical to use the far reading, the distant reading methodology.
That's right. And so having an awareness of the question you're asking and the method you want to use is very important. I mentioned that all these fields, all these debates I was talking about always have the essay that's written that says, this has exhausted itself. Evidence for exhaustion is often, this is a thoughtless application of the method to the problem. So even though distant reading is about 10 years old now, let's say, I can already imagine 20 years from now, those damn distant readers, they just, same thing. I knew where the essay was going to end as soon as it began, right? As soon as I saw the graph with the years and stuff like that. I like your question though, because yes, you're absolutely right that it's incumbent on the researcher to be aware of the methods that he or she is applying to the problem. Yeah, very nice. Yeah.
I just had a question about the close reading as it pertains to the scientific study of the text itself.
Yeah.
With every other form of study, like if we're gonna since you're here, if we can go back 2.5 million years ago and ask somebody, what are you using this stone for? Then we would.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But like if T.S. Eliot walks into the room, then you're irrelevant. Like that doesn't. Yeah. How does the text itself stand apart to that extent that the author's intent and what he wrapped up into it makes no reference?
That's interesting. It's a nice question. I can just tell you what the assumption that they're making. I can't defend it, okay? But the assumption is that language is what they call a public form of evidence. This is the New Critics, okay? And that we have the poem that we have. If T.S. Eliot comes in and says that line right there about eating a peach actually meant this other thing, then the New Critic would respond, but that's not what you wrote, okay? So we have the language that we have. It's public form of evidence. They say that it's a paradox because it's actually internal, but it's public. And they say that okay, if you were going to change the line about the peach, then we would have a different poem, and that would change the judgments that we make.
A lot of the stuff, like the concepts and everything, I'm not like an English major or anything at all, so it's kind of new. But from a standpoint of as far as like spark notes go, so you can kind of understand literature, like those things are kind of like static, where I don't know, where it's just like this means this apparently, and this means this. So it's like easy to kind of read if you need to read it really quick. But if you were to actually analyze that book, that wouldn't really be helpful, would it? Because it's kind of like one person's or a general agreement on what these certain things mean and what's important of this book. But if you were to analyze it on your own or in a certain way, then that would be pointless because you're taking that into your own analysis. I don't know.
Yeah, I would just say this, that the method of literary analysis that's taught in a class like literary interpretation, L202, is assuming that there is a there's a method to asking questions about literature. It's about noticing patterns that emerge from the language. It's about noticing oppositions, right? And that work is fundamentally interpretive, which is to say it's an attempt to explain something that is implicit. Okay, so the word implicit means folded within. It doesn't mean not there. And the job of of literary analysis is to make what's already there and to unfold it, make it explicit. Okay, that's analytical. That's interpretive. That's not descriptive in the way that a plot summary would be on SparkNotes.com. SparkNotes.com, I think, goes to they describe the series of chapters and then they go to analysis, I believe, right? I'm not sure if I can judge those analyses, but what I'm suggesting is that from the perspective of literary studies as it's evolved across the 19th century, the assumption is that meaning is there and that it needs to be unfolded through methodologies developed by experts. That's why the guy who just wants to sort of speak poetry beautifully, that's why that doesn't work. Because that's not making something that's implicit explicit. That's just acting as if meaning's transparent. Whereas the assumption that a field like English makes is that meaning is in fact not transparent, that literature proceeds through indirection and these kinds of things. Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here.